Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. Have we ever got an exciting event lined up for you? I am so glad that you could join us. I see everybody logging in as we go. Let me know where you're from so we can give special shout outs to our friends, old and new alike, as we gather together for the day. We're going to have today another in our exciting series of the CB&A Expert Series webinars. I really thank you for taking the time to join us today. Beautiful day here in Wisconsin. The sun is shining. It's going to be about 49, 50 degrees for a high, which this time of year, pre-Thanksgiving, y'all, this is a pretty special weather period for us. So thank you for that. Julie, out of curiosity, what's the weather looking like for you these days?
Well, Charlene, I'm in Southern California. And
Lucky.
so we are into full-on fall here in Southern California. So temperature outside at my house right now is 64 degrees, just a beautiful sunny fall day in Orange County, California.
Well, and I expect it's probably going to get a little bit warmer. I'm also going to expect that in California, anything with a 6 in the front of it means people are walking around with their big puffy jackets like we put on when it's below freezing, right?
Absolutely. Scarves. We have a lot of boots. People are wearing boots at 64
Mittens.
degrees. Yeah, it's
Absolutely. Well, I am so glad everybody can join us today. And I can see again that everybody is logging in. We appreciate the time that you've taken to log in to our Getting Real, the 5 essential truths about ed tech in schools today webinar. I have to do a huge shout out to everybody on the CB&A team who's helped make this expert series happen. Emily Embry, who was with us here today, Liz Meyer. There are many industry friends and colleagues who are help spreading the word about today's event. And we are not in Austin, Texas, where it's 79 degrees, but apparently we will be there in the spring months for some of our live events. So Wendy, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started as more folks log in for us today. For those of you who I've not yet had the opportunity to meet, I'm Charlene Bloom. I'm the president of CB&A. Today I'm at the home office. I'm reaching you just a few miles from Monona, which is where the headquarters is. We are on the other side of Madison and the Wisconsin State Capitol building. We're about 3 blocks away from the lake and then a little bit of a canoe paddle over toward the Capitol. We're about 2.5 hours from Lambeau Field for those of you who want to talk football. I created C. Bloom & Associates, or CB&A, as you all know it, because marketing and selling in the education sector is really a trip like no other. Founded in 1991, CB&A is the most experienced marketing communications agency specializing in the U.S. education market. We accelerate the growth of companies that provide products and services to K-12 school systems to higher education institutions. We believe that by accelerating our clients' growth, we're contributing to positive outcomes for students and for educators. But enough on me. I can't wait for you to spend some time today with Julie. So let me just describe Julie as an education social entrepreneur. She's got a doctorate in educational leadership. She has decades of tech industry experience. Dr. Evans, or Julie, I hope it's okay to go by Julie today, is the CEO of Project Tomorrow. She's also the founder of the Speak Up Research Projects, which collects and reports authentic views of hundreds of thousands of students, educators, and parents each year. And we're going to look at some of that today, which is really exciting. She's the chief researcher on the Speak Up project. She also leads all of the organization's research on the impact of innovative learning models and interventions, both in K-12 and higher ed. She does that for us as vendors, which we really appreciate. Over the past 17 plus years, more than 6 million kids, teachers, and parents have participated in the Speak Up project, and that includes all 50 states, the District of Columbia, people from around the world. So excited to hear some of those data points today. Among her many accolades and awards, I just have to shout out for one. In 2020, Julie was named the winner of EdTech Digest's National Leader Award. So congratulations to Julie for that. I'm honored to share that this is her second appearance in the CB&A Expert Series. Even more significantly, she's presented, perhaps the better use of the word there would be testified, at more than 25 congressional briefings. You were on Capitol Hill just last month to share some key findings, Julie, and maybe that'll weave into today's presentation as well. The focus there was on equity. I just have to give a special shout out as well to all of the student panelists who joined you that day at Capitol Hill. Oh, warm your heart, warm your heart. I'm going to turn it over to Julie here in just a second. And before I do, just a quick reminder to make sure that everybody uses the Q&A feature of the interface for questions for us to do at the end. we're going to have some fun with a chat feature during the actual event today. So Julie, over to you. Here we go.
Thanks so much, Charlene. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today, folks. I love working with CBNA. They actually have provided us with support around many of our different initiatives over the last couple of years, and a great big hug to the whole CBNA team. So
thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting me to come back. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm going to tee it up with some of our research data, but then I love the back and forth, the questions, your insights, your comments as well. So we're going to start off getting to know each other a little bit better than we already do. I'll tell you a little bit more about Project Tomorrow on the Speak Up research. And then we're going to talk about these 5 truths about ed tech in schools today. We're going to start off with checking some assumptions at the door. So hold on to that. Then we'll dive into those 5 truths. But to really understand the context of the 5 truths, we have to look at the dynamics around digital learning today. What's driving some of those new initiatives? What might potentially be holding back some of the things that you're interested in promoting into schools and districts? And then, as I said, would love to be able to engage with you and with Charlene in a conversation about what this means for your business. But to get started, many of you already know the drill. Introduce yourself in the chat, say hello, tell us where you're from, maybe what organization or company that you're with. That would be great, so we get to know each other a little bit better. And in addition to that, I have a second thing that I want you to put into the chat. So over the last, year and a half, let's just say, since we started on this pandemic-induced journey, the sudden shift to virtual learning, I've been doing a special series of focus groups and interviews and panel discussions. Charlene mentioned the one that I did with the students just a couple of weeks ago. And in that conversation, I've been asking people about how do they feel about this school year. So I put up for you here the 5 top adjectives that educators are telling me around their state of mind, their mindset, their feelings about this school year. I'd love to know what you think educators are feeling. So if any of these sing to you in terms of your interactions with school and district leaders, with superintendents, with administrators at all different ranks, school district level, county, service center level, even at the state, tell me what you think they're saying or feeling about this school year. Are they apprehensive? Are they nostalgic? Are they hopeful? Are they exhausted? Are they settling in terms of accepting what's happening? Give me your thoughts as to what that means. And we'll share a little bit with that. Definitely folks are exhausted and barely hanging in there. So thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing that. Now, a little bit as you're doing that, a little bit more about Project Tomorrow. We are an education nonprofit group. We've been supporting K-12 education since 1996. We have a particular focus on the role of innovation and new learning models within the education system. What does that mean in terms of impact? What does that mean in terms of outcomes? How can we improve those outcomes? Now, we facilitate that nonprofit mission through 2 different paths. One is the Speak Up Research Project. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. That's all about helping K-12 leaders develop greater capacities for using data assets. But in addition to that, we also conduct every year a special series of evaluation, efficacy studies, and feedback studies on behalf of companies, nonprofits, foundations, state organizations, museums, all sorts of different folks. That again gets to that conversation around what is the impact, what are the outcomes, what is the ROI around these new learning models. I'd be happy to chat with folks more about how we do that work. We actually have a very special methodology that we do that's really geared into helping learning companies understand what the impact is of their own initiatives. Now, what's really interesting in all of this is that, as I said, this is about the Speak Up Research Project. So what we're going to be looking at today is data from the research project that we've conducted since 2003. So what we do every year is we create a series of online surveys that we provide to any K-12 school or district that wants to use them to get feedback from their stakeholders. We then give back to those schools and districts their own locally collected data, as well as national and state level data to use for benchmarks. Again, as I mentioned, this is about helping school and district leaders understand how to use the voices, the views, the ideas of their students, their teachers, their parents, their administrators to impact their local decisions. This is 100% a free service that we provide to K-12 schools and districts. And we work very closely with a small group of companies that sponsor this work and make this available nationwide to any school or district that wants to participate. Now we take the national data and create a series of reports and infographics. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can access those later on. But what I'm going to do now is share with you some of those key findings that we've uncovered over the past year that I thought would be a great way to start our conversation. So these are just a couple of headline findings, insights, with a particular focus on, so what has been the impact of the pandemic, the disruption in schools, the shift to remote learning, virtual learning? What has been the long-standing or long-tail impact on K-12 education? What are we starting to see? So there's a couple things that are really interesting here as we get into this conversation. Now, one thing has been that we actually went through, you all were part of this, kind of a real-time lab environment on virtual learning, particularly on a large scale. So will that be sustained? Are we going to feel the pull of nostalgia back to the pre-pandemic days, or is that going to be the impetus for us to push further for innovation? We're definitely hearing from stakeholders. And again, each year we poll students, teachers, parents, and administrators. So it's a very diverse set of stakeholders. But we're seeing that folks are more interested in adopting maybe a broader definition about what learning looks like, or at least what effective learning looks like. Relative to technology, you know, it was really interesting during remote learning and even continuing into last year that the job of technology changed. What the expectation was around technology previously really was 100% focused in on technology as an engagement tool. And then suddenly it became a learning platform and the core components of the learning process. Now, we know that in our schools and districts, there's a lot more emphasis being placed on social justice issues, a lot more focus on the social and mental and emotional health, not only of students, but of staff. And then also increased focus on parents, on what their new demands and expectations might be for their local education institutions. That's having a ripple effect into some of the decisions that school and district leaders are making. We're actually going to talk more about that in a couple of moments. There also have been a lot of renewed or new conversations around what do we really mean by equity? And is equity just about giving students a Chromebook and a hotspot? Or does it really go beyond that? We're going to talk about that as well. And then, of course, since we have so much more technology that is in the hands of students, and that is distributed even outside of our schools into home settings, there is a great need to understand the new vulnerabilities around cyber attacks and what that means going forward. We're actually doing a new webinar on that aspect alone, the cybersecurity issues, in December. We can talk a little bit more about that later also as well. But you know, what's really interesting in all of this, and I gave you a range of the different insights that we're seeing out there, but the reality is we all see things differently, right? It depends upon what our experiences are. It depends upon what our interaction is with what types of players in the education ecosystem. It depends upon how we were impacted during the pandemic directly. So it's a little bit like this image that I'm showing you here. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but some of us might look at this image here on the left and say, oh, I see that. It's a woman in a long dress. kind of swishing through some leaves, maybe a fall scene. It looks like almost like she's wearing a fur coat. So maybe she's up in Wisconsin. It may also be that you see a face, or some of you might see a face, very strong patrician forehead, deep set eyes, strong features. Now, some of us folks might see both of these images. Some of us might not see either of these images. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that when we talk about the impact of the pandemic, when we talk about the role of education technology, when we talk about the future of education technology, we may not all be seeing things through the same lens. We may not be seeing things through the same perspectives. And in fact, that's happening in schools and districts today as well. What the students and parents might be seeing, what their sightlines might be around the impact of the pandemic, or what they want education to be for them, might be very different than what the decision makers are looking at. And so what we like to talk about is that we can use the Speak Up research, which brings forward the authentic views of students, of teachers, of parents, administrators at all levels, to kind of cut through some of this fog and to really be able to understand what the real perspectives are that are out there, because that helps us chart the path to the future. So I told you we were going to check some assumptions at the door, so get ready to participate in this little game in the chat box. So what we have here are 4 statements that are based on the Speak Up research. But hold on, folks, 3 of them are true and 1 is false. So what I'd like you to do to check your assumptions at the door is identify for us in the chat box which one you think is the false assumption, not the true assumption. So you can just put the letter up in the chat box. So the first one is that students are no less engaged in their schoolwork today than they were prior to the pandemic. It's the same level of engagement. And the second one is that parents' #1 concern today is not learning loss. The third one, item C, is that most students say that their best learning environment is in a physical classroom. And D is that most teachers are very comfortable using digital tools to support learning now because of their experience using technology in the classroom. Now, we are going to come back to this at the end of our time together before Charlene and I do your Q&A period to give you the right answers. But pay attention. This is the teacher in me. Pay attention, because the answers actually will be revealed while I go over the research findings. So we're going to take a look first at the 5 truths about ed tech in schools. I'm going to be using research data for 2 years. In some cases, we're going to look pre-pandemic. In some cases, we're going to look during pandemic and also after pandemic. The idea here is to give you some perspective, some context, some new sight lines, and to help you with your priorities. First one, here we go, folks, get ready. The first one is that, in fact, the shift to remote digital learning in spring 2020 changed everything in K-12 education, quite literally. Some folks may not realize that. I'm whispering here because we don't want them to feel that. But in fact, that has happened. And so we need to understand what that means. A couple things I'll tell you from a reality standpoint is that one of the things that we learned is that high amounts of usage of digital products, digital tools, and digital resources did not mean that that was being used effectively. In fact, in many cases, it was just sporadic use. It wasn't good pedagogical use. It was just use for engagement. The other thing that we learned from that experience was that there are so many products that are out in the marketplace to help school and district leaders achieve their goals, that in fact, those school and district leaders are making much more informed decisions today than ever before. So many, and maybe many of you that are here with us today, were so generous in terms of providing your products for free or at reduced licenses during the pandemic, during the remote learning phase, that actually had the impact of increasing the knowledge of school and district leaders about what products they liked, didn't like, what they needed, what they didn't need. The other reality moment here, folks, is that in fact, we learned that teachers are not yet ready for the type of ed tech integration, the seamless integration that we've all been talking about for so long, that they weren't ready prior to the pandemic. And in fact, I'm going to show you some data that they still have a long way to go to understand how to use this technology effectively. Now, our second essential truth is that in fact, education leaders need and want help adjusting and adapting to this new realities around education. But they also need help in understanding what the real potential of ed tech could be. Now, I know, folks, I know for many of us, you're probably already thinking, we've been talking about this, Julie, for so long. We've been talking about the potential of ed tech. We've been talking about the value proposition. We've been talking about how this impacts student outcomes and teacher effectiveness. But the window was not open before to really help leaders understand what this means. That window is open now, and they are looking for help. So a couple points here I'll share with you from a reality standpoint. I saw, I'm sure you did too, that in some places, the knee-jerk reaction to remote learning was to try and take what we were doing in the classroom and just stick it online. Well, we know that that didn't work. We knew it wasn't going to work. Real learning model adoption, whether that is the use of technology, project-based learning, competency-based learning, virtual learning, requires teachers to not only rethink what they're doing from instructional practices, but actually re-engineer the whole process. And that is much harder work than many people thought. Previously, in many schools, most teachers were actually kind of nibbling around the edges. I'll change a little something here. Rather than doing that book report, we'll do a PowerPoint. The challenge with that is that we are never going to get to truly effective usage. We're never going to get to the real potential of education technology by nibbling around the edges. We have to think about changing the mindsets of teachers to think about the role of these digital tools in a different light, going back to that view that we have and understanding where they're coming from. But professional learning to date has not been sufficient to change the mindset. We've changed some behaviors, we've helped them with some new skills, but we haven't changed the mindsets yet. The third essential truth that I believe everyone should know is that parents are already playing a bigger role regarding technology use than what was ever expected. And we're going to continue to see the role of parents increasing in and impacting the decisions that schools and districts and school boards make around technology. Now, maybe in your work, you haven't interacted with parents. Maybe those conversations haven't even come up in terms of what the community wants or what stakeholders are saying, but we're going to start seeing that happening. There's a couple things that happened here. As parents had that kitchen table view of what learning looks like today and how technology supports learning, they have a much more informed viewpoint because of that kitchen table view. Now that has had two impacts. One, parents are very focused in on the role of technology in helping students develop the skills they need for future success, college and workplace. The path to understanding the valuation or the why of education technology in our schools to parents is about future ready skill development. However, the other side of that coin is screen time is still a big issue. Now, we've been calculating and reporting on the screen time issue, too much screen time, since about 2005. I have a lot of data on this. Prior to the pandemic, parents were very concerned about too much screen time outside of school. They're now much more concerned about too much screen time inside of school. I'll give you a reason for that in a moment. The other thing that's really important is to think about communications home to school. That actually was totally blown up because of the pandemic. Digital and online communications are really the ways that schools are communicating with parents and parents are communicating back with teachers in schools. The fourth one is about connecting the dots and has to do with efficacy around the use of technology within learning. This was the last time I was here on the CBNA Expert Series. Charlene and I talked about efficacy research. I mentioned that we do a lot of that. I strongly believe, and we have proof cases from some of the work that we've done, that in fact you can measure and yield tangible outcomes from the use of technology when it is used effectively. But we have to understand that when we're talking with school and district leaders, we have to connect the dots for them. They're not going to necessarily understand that just using technology is going to help them achieve their goals. You actually have to show them. But the key thing, folks, is it has to be used effectively. Too often, what I see in our efficacy research work is that folks will go in and do an efficacy study, an impact study, an evaluation study too soon. Teachers have to be using the tools effectively before you can measure that efficacy. So a couple examples here. I mentioned before that decision makers are more sophisticated about ed tech today by virtue of having access to so many more digital products, all the wonderful products that many of you probably produce. They have gotten much savvier about what works in their school, what doesn't work in their school. Feedback from their teachers, feedback from students, feedback from parents. Consequently, they have a higher bar that they're looking for today in terms of making those evaluations. We still are not at a point, and this is a general statement, of course, your mileage may differ. We also may see different things in different schools and districts. But for the most part, I am not seeing that we are at a tipping point in terms of the effectiveness of education technology in most classrooms. We still have more work to do. And then my fifth key truth is sort of a teaser one for you. There's actually more questions today, I'm finding, relative to how technology should be used, what types of digital tools are most effective, what needs to be done to help teachers use these tools more effectively. There's more questions today than answers. But what we do know is that one size fits no one. And that's actually a good thing for you. And it's also a good thing to think about embracing questions, because that's where we start to see the opportunities. So let's talk a little bit more about these opportunities and some of the questions that are out there. I gave you just a small sampling here of some of the questions that are out there. These are things that I'm sure your folks are talking with school and district leaders about, or maybe you're overhearing these conversations. You know, there's a lot of conversation. How are schools going to address the learning loss, the learning recovery, the need for learning acceleration, whatever it might be. Lots of conversations about engagement. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. This idea of what are really meaningful and valid outcomes. How do we measure that? And how do we play the long ball game with the CARES and ESSER funds? Do we just buy for today, or do we really think about transformation and using those funds for transformation? Lots of conversations around social emotional learning and the role of technology in that. Lots of conversations also about equity and about communications. We could go on with the questions, and I'm sure you can add in some of the questions that you're seeing as well. But what I want to do is I want to flip the script a little bit, because I think to really understand these 5 truths and to understand what they mean for you and what the opportunities are for you, we have to look at dynamics in the space. We have to understand what is happening from the desk of that superintendent, from the teacher's classroom environment, from the principal's office. What is actually happening in the dynamics of the ecosystem to understand what that means for the success of your digital learning implementations. So where are those new opportunities? So we're going to start with this question. What issues are waking up K-12 school and district leaders in the middle of the night? It's a landmark question, a foundational question on the Speak Up surveys every year. And we've been doing that work, as I said, since 2003. So it's been absolutely fascinating to not only see how those priorities, because this is a statement about priorities, how those priorities or challenges have changed, but how they differ by the different levels of administration. So when we look at, for example, the top 5 wake-up issues for superintendents and district administrators, and then compare that with school principals, we see some differences. Superintendents, district administrators, student learning loss, number 1, by far and away, number 1 issue that's waking them up. That speaks to a challenge they have that could be addressed, that could be an opportunity for companies and organizations that want to partner with schools and districts. We need to be cognizant of that. But right behind it is the concern about staff morale and motivation. So how does the use of technology impact that particular challenge? Concern about students and the support that we're providing them as well. And then number 4 on the list from last year was, are the technology tools that we've invested in, are they being used effectively? Now, technology, to be quite honest with you, has been in the top 10 for superintendents and district administrators for as long as we have been polling on this. It has never been in the number 4 position. So they are not only interested in using technology, but they want to make sure it's used effectively. Also from the superintendent's office is this concern that the funding that we see today, the CARES ESSER money, how do I sustain some of the investments that I'm making? Now, the principals list has similar things: the mental and emotional supports for students, the staff morale and motivation, the learning loss, the impact on staff, and also closing the achievement gap. So we see the difference based on where people are in their responsibility areas. And the same thing is true for CIOs, CTOs, and directors of technology. It reflects their perspective. It reflects the way they're looking out at the world and their responsibilities. So number 1 topic for CIOs, CTOs, directors of technology right now is cybersecurity. Ransomware, cyber attack concerns. What's happening with that? How do they prepare for it? They're also concerned about data privacy. They're concerned about digital access for students at home. That's the equity piece. And then also, again, we see staff morale and motivation. So that's the common thread through all of these wake-up issues, is this concern around staff morale and motivation. And what does that mean in terms of the way that we're thinking about making sure that technology is being used effectively? You know, a key thing in the CIO, CTO arena that I've been hearing is the increased workload in terms of supporting all of this technology that's out there today. So what we're really looking at, to be quite honest with you, is a new playbook in terms of understanding the way education technology is valued, what the expectation is for usage, how we're going to measure the effectiveness of it, and thus that yields new opportunities. Now, I want to talk today specifically about equity and student engagement, because those are 2 very strong dynamics that are influencing decisions that school and district leaders are making today. So I want to make sure that you have the very latest findings from us on those 2 key points. Now, we can talk about other types of dynamics, other opportunities, other things in the playbook, other X's and O's here that can drive some of your efforts, and be happy to have those conversations individually with you or afterwards. But we'll start off with equity and student engagement today. Equity is top of mind for most educators. We see that across different types of communities, urban, rural, and suburban. We see it in large districts as well as small districts. We see it at the school principal level. We see it at the district level. It is a top of mind concern that overrides so many other things that are happening right now. The concern as to whether or not we are providing equitable education for all children. Now, a really interesting glimmer here is that 6 out of 10 district leaders say they believe the effective use of technology within learning can support equity. So they're making that connection between the effective use of technology and their equity goals. But here's the problem, folks. For too long, we have not fully defined what we mean by equity in education. So for the last 2.5, 3 years, I've been talking about equity across 4 different vectors. Now, equity of access, we all understand. That's about making sure that students have the devices that they need to be able to continue learning, to be able to do homework, doing those type of things outside of school. And we definitely saw, as a result of the investments that have been made over the last couple of years, a shift in terms of student access to technology. So let me take you back to the 2018-19 school year. I know it feels so long ago. About 4 in 10 school principals said that their one-to-one programs, giving devices to kids, allowed those devices to take home. 4 in 10. 50% of the principals said there was no plans to send those devices home with kids. And we can talk about all the different reasons that principals didn't want to send devices home with kids. Fast forward to this past school year. 9 in 10 say that they are providing devices for students to use at school and at home, and 3/4 have a Wi-Fi hotspot loaner program. In just a 2 school year timeframe, we went from a very different situation in terms of student access to a much richer experience for students in terms of access. But the work isn't done there. Our data tells us that now between 9 and 11% of students say they're impacted by the homework gap. That's a decrease from 13% prior to the pandemic, but still, we still have equity of access. So I don't want to put the check mark next to equity of access and say it's done, but I do want to draw your attention to 3 different types of equity in education conversations that are happening in schools and districts right now that you need to be aware of, because there are opportunities here for you to help these school and district leaders address these challenges. The first one has to do with equity in the learning experiences. Do students have equitable learning experiences, whether that means teacher quality, access to instructional materials, access to different types of learning programs? Equity supporting student success. Do students have the opportunity to learn in classrooms, environments, and schools where they feel valued, where they believe it is safe for them to learn, where they have supportive relationships? This is some of the social, emotional, and mental health supports. And then the third type of equity that I want to draw your eyes to is equity of student agency. Are students empowered to take ownership of their learning? Are we personalizing the learning process to meet students with what they need to be successful? Or are we still standing with a one-size-fits-all mantra that we know never fit anyone? So let's look at each one of these just very quickly from an individual standpoint. I'll just give you some of the Speak Up data research here so you have a contextual understanding of this. So when we looked at the equity and learning opportunities, we want to understand not only teachers' skill, but teachers' comfort. So we can train teachers all day long, you know that, but will they implement some of these new tools or some of these new teaching practices? And does it become part of their DNA? Does it become part of their everyday instructional practices? So we took a look at some common teacher practices using technology, and then looked at it across 3 different environments: teachers in urban schools, teachers in suburban schools, and teachers in rural schools. Now, I'll just draw your eyes to a couple of these. You can read the other ones. So for example, the idea of engaging students when learning is online. Last school year, 2021 school year, 53% of teachers in urban schools said, yes, I'm very comfortable doing that now. Only a tiny bit more than 1/3 of teachers in rural schools, however, said they were comfortable with that. So we've got this disconnect between teachers in different schools, which can lend us to believing that maybe the educational learning opportunities are not equitable across all of our schools. Look at also this idea of differentiating instruction. We have been talking about using technology to differentiate instruction in classrooms for a long, long time. And there's been a lot of professional learning for teachers about that. And yet in our rural communities and even in our suburban communities, less than 1/3 of teachers say they are very comfortable using technology in that way. So folks, when we talk about the efficacy of using technology, and we can fill in the blank on any different types of products, learning models, whatever it might be, we have not gotten to that tipping point until we can see not only the majority of teachers saying they're very comfortable, but maybe a plurality somewhere closer to 70, 80%. So we still have a lot more work to do here in terms of not just making teachers feel more comfortable, but understanding what that means in terms of equity. Now, here's another one. We talked about the idea of equity supporting student success. And for this, we have to look at what the students themselves report about their learning environment. Many schools and districts use our Speak Up data around these sort of school climate questions to do some state reporting, for example. What we did here is that we compared middle school students that are in schools where a majority of the students are white with students that are in schools where the majority of the students are students of color. And sadly, folks, we still see a disconnect. So look, just these are middle school students. Look just at this item here in the middle. My school cares about me as an individual. 44% of the students that were in schools with other white students said that was true for them. Only about 1/3 of students that were in schools where the majority was students of color feel that way. We should not be able to look away from this sort of a situation and say that's acceptable. And there's so much more that schools and districts want to do with this. And we need to think about ways to help them in that area. And then in terms of student agency, I just want to share with you some really interesting data analysis we did last year. During the 2021 school year, we were able to disaggregate our Speak Up data based on the school format. So the schools that were attending, the students, I'm sorry, that were attending school in fully virtual environments versus students that were in fully in-person environments. We also looked at variations of hybrid as well. Excuse me. What is fascinating is that when we ask the students, what do you think is the best learning environment for you based on the experience that you've had? 27% of the students that had been in fully virtual learning environments, these are middle school, high school students, 27% said, I think I learned best in a virtual classroom setting. And in fact, 16% of the students that weren't virtual were fully in-person learning environments. They also said they think they learned best in a virtual. One second, folks. This is really fascinating when we think about how are schools addressing individual student needs. How are they making sure that they are meeting students where they are in terms of their needs for different types of empowering learning environments? 27% and 16%. That's a large group of students that actually say they think they learn best in a virtual environment. So when we think about this playbook, we talked about equity. I want to take you to the other side of this because the equity conversation, particularly the student empowerment conversation, gets us right to student engagement. Educators are also really interested in student engagement. We know this. And why is that? We know that too. The research has long shown that if students are engaged in learning, we have a better shot at achieving the types of academic outcomes that we're interested in. And so I love to talk about student engagement as like the elusive secret sauce that folks are trying to find. How do we drive student engagement? We know that teachers are concerned about decreases in student engagement. They're seeing it in their classroom. But we also know for a lot of folks, they tell me all the time, well, I know it when I see it. I know student engagement when I see it because either I'm looking at the number of assignments students have completed or their feedback, they like the lesson, they didn't like the lesson, or they're giving me the head nod, the smiley faces, the shiny eyes, all of that. They are also looking at some academic outcomes, but it's hard to make that connection. So this conversation around engagement is really interesting because it shows up also in terms of what parents are thinking about. And in fact, 50% of parents say that they are concerned about the level of their own students, their own child's engagement and learning. 50% of parents said that. But this goes back to our true and false question, folks. In fact, the number one thing that parents are concerned about regarding their child's future, though, is not that, and is not learning loss. It's about the impact of all the disruptions in the education process and what that's meant to their child's social and emotional well-being. That's why that is such a top of mind issue for school and district leaders right now, that they are laser focused on that. Now, the other one I want to point out here, which is also really interesting, is again this idea that parents are concerned that their child is not learning the right skills in school to be successful in the future. That comes back to that value proposition for parents, which is about connecting the dots from the use of technology to helping students be prepared for college, for the workforce. Do they have those types of skills that they need to be successful? But you know, this conversation about student engagement has gone a little crazy in schools and districts because folks are really concerned not only about the impact on learning loss and the impact on student engagement, but was it directly tied to remote learning? And some folks are making that connection. They're saying that there's a connection between the pandemic and remote learning in terms of the way students are thinking about the learning process. And this has implications for the way they're thinking about the use of technology as well. So let me unpack some data here for you that I think is going to be really interesting. We've been tracking student engagement in school-based learning for several years. And I can tell you that based on our data findings, it was not the result of the pandemic. It was not the result of school disruptions. And in fact, we see very consistent numbers from the 2019-20 school year, before school closures, during school closures, and even last year. So for example, middle school students before the pandemic, 46% of them said they did not agree with the statement that I'm engaged in what I'm learning in school most of the time. 46% said that was false for them. During school closures, 45% said that was false for them. And this past year, 51% said it was false for them. The numbers are very consistent over time. About 50% of our students say they're engaged in what they're learning in school most of the time. 50% say they are not. So from a wake-up moment for schools and districts, we have to be thinking about it. Can't be blamed on the pandemic. It can't be blamed on remote learning. We have to be actually thinking about what that learning process looks like. Now, for lots of folks, it's been easy over the last couple of years to equate technology use with student engagement. And in fact, in many, many years of reporting on this data, I would report in our reports, our congressional briefings, our infographics, that according to teachers, according to principals, according to district administrators, the number one outcome from using technology within learning is increased student engagement. So this created kind of a cognitive dissonance over the past year. We used a lot more technology, yet the students seemed to be less engaged in school. Why was that? Because in fact, the metrics weren't right. When we're looking at the metrics, just looking at student engagement, even though the administrators continue to do it, was insufficient to understanding really the value proposition around technology. So we have here an opportunity to sort of rebrand the value of digital learning. And I offer to you the wisdom of sixth graders to help you with that. When we ask sixth graders, what is the value of digital learning in your learning life? They do not talk about, I am more engaged in learning. I like using the technology because it's engaging for me. I'm more motivated to learn when I have a device in my hand or when I'm playing an online game. The kids themselves don't talk about that. They talk about outcomes. They talk about academic outcomes. They talk about skill development outcomes. They talk about personalized learning outcomes. Those are the outcomes that they talk about. And yet, for many of us, we have been sheepish maybe to go in the direction of really understanding the efficacy and the value proposition of ed tech around some of these conversations. But I think the time is here now. We need to be thinking about how we're messaging education technology to school and district leaders and how they're messaging it to parents so that we are in alignment. And it's fascinating to me that the students have been ahead of us in this conversation. So as we think about this new playbook, we think about these new opportunities, the question for all of you is, what is your role going to be in helping the educators, the school and district leaders that you're working with navigate this new environment? Now, as I said, we went through a little bit of looking at those 5 truths, and then I shared with you some information on the dynamics. I hope this was fascinating. I want to get into the conversation with Charlene with some of your questions, some of your insights. But before we do that, we have a little housekeeping to do. We have to go back to our quiz, our true and false quiz. And I saw in the chat that we were kind of all over the board. Some people chose A, some people chose B, some people chose C, and some folks also chose D. Well, I can tell you, if you haven't already picked it up, A, B, and C were in fact true. The one that is false at this point is D. Our teachers are not more comfortable. They are not very comfortable yet in terms of digital tools to support learning. And that is an important challenge that we all need to address. We need to help teachers feel more comfortable, whether that's through professional learning, whether through the use of different products, supporting their efforts, and also making sure that school and district administrators understand that just handing out devices or providing the codes for the licenses is not by itself going to result in effective usage. The other thing I want to share with you from a housekeeping standpoint is we talked about these adjectives. I saw many of you shared what you thought the key adjectives were from administrators, from teachers, from the folks you're dealing with. What I want to share with you is what students tell me. Students went into this school year incredibly hopeful, but it was about change. It wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't about going back to the way learning was before. In fact, they are more interested in creating a new school for the future. So if you are interested in more Speak Up research, data from us, please come and visit us at tomorrow.org. We have our reports there, our infographics. We also can talk to you about doing some of the consulting work and efficacy and evaluation studies that we do as well. And with that, I see Charlene is back and we're ready to do some questions, maybe some insights, some comments from our audience. I can't wait.
Julie, you were just absolutely amazing. I really appreciate the time, the attention, the way you break it down and dive deep into various things. I am curious if you could just give us a personal perspective on top of the data. You've been doing this for a while, and there's a question that I picked up out of chat that I'll come to second. And please, again, submit, folks, your Q&A questions. Use that little Q&A feature inside the Zoom platform here. But Julie, just tell me from your personal perspective, longitudinally, personally, what are you seeing that's really popping out to you over the data here now over time? I want to point out that you do custom research for people for vendors. And I want to thank you for that because you mentioned that as well. And I know some of our clients have done that. But just inside what you're thinking, seeing, and observing, what's sticking out to you after all these years?
I think the key thing is that this is a very unique time and place we're in right now, Charlene. That's why I love to talk about the opportunities with some of the different vendors and companies that are with us. Because for a long time, folks would ask me that same question. I'd say, oh, it's been really interesting, but we're seeing real plateauing. We're not seeing where teachers are even interested in trying new things. We're not seeing where they're changing their mindsets. We're not seeing any momentum. We're not seeing excitement. We're not seeing enthusiasm. It's been a very hard road, obviously, for the last 20 months, really difficult. But yet it opened the eyes to so many people. I am so encouraged by the teachers and the principals I'm talking with who said, I never realized, fill in the blank, what technology could do for my students. So I think that we're at a very unique opportunity right now that I hope people take advantage of. But as I said, you have to be cognizant of what the realities are in the schools and districts and what those 5 truths are. because it isn't the same playbook that we had before. We need to have a new playbook to help school and district leaders realize some of this potential.
And when you were sharing the opportunities, I have to just quickly insert that social emotional learning is how we as a vendor community tend to refer to what parents tend to refer to as student well-being. And you can see some of the way the students responded toward the end in your data, how the students are really trying to help us find a path here. I think that there's some really strong statements in there, Julie, and I can see several of the folks who are with us today being able to pull pieces and parts of your data and make tweaks and adjustments to their marketing programs and plans and coming out of it on top. I want to come back to a question that Denise raised when you were talking about engagement, particularly on the parent side. And she was curious to know about students who are students who are the children of disengaged parents. Does that put them at a disadvantage? What kind of a disadvantage is that? And then let's expand on what some opportunities might be around that. That was a great question from Denise. Let's spend a minute on answering all of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Our schools and districts always talk about wanting engaged parents. They want parents to be engaged in their child's learning lives. Let's be honest, folks. Many schools and districts have not done a good job of adequately engaging parents or using the right tools to engage parents. The example I'll use is if the only time you can meet with your child's teacher is 11 o'clock in the morning on a school day, you're not opening the door to engage parents. So what happened during the pandemic is suddenly we had this opportunity to engage with parents at different times and to have the opportunity to engage with them using different tools. So one, we're seeing parents are more engaged here than ever before. But you're absolutely right. If parents are not engaged in their child's education today or during the pandemic, they missed an opportunity to really understand what learning looks like today. I talk with parents all the time. I do focus groups with parents all the time. And it's amazing to me that many of them will say to me, I've never had the opportunity to go into my child's physical classroom. I don't know what second grade looks like today, or I don't know what sixth grade science looks like
Good
today.
point.
I think that I think the opportunity is on schools and districts to think about community engagement, to think about parent education from the lens of the parent. It's sort of like that image I showed you. Sometimes we look at things through our own lens, but to look at it from the lens of the parents, what do they need? That's why we see, for example, and I know that it terrifies teachers, 2/3 of parents want to have a texting relationship with their child's teacher. They want to text back and forth. So my child misbehaved, text me at work. You're going to try calling me at work, I may not be able to answer, or you're going to send a note home with the child. That's not going to work. We have to understand that the engagement tools need to change because it does impact the child. It does impact the way they think about school themselves. And so it's important.
I really appreciate that. That's a nice in-depth response. And I remember reading something probably 15 years ago already now that, an indicator of 8th grade academic success, one of the things to look at is 3rd grade parental involvement. And so to your point, if we can find ways to communicate more with parents, I think that makes a ton of difference. There's another question that's come in, Julie, because you're so good at this. It's come from Angela, and she's trying to understand the research. We've talked a lot about middle school kids today, and what can you tell us about the even younger, shorter K3 kids versus those who are sort of 4+? I'm guessing Angela works in a market with younger children. So can you tell us anything that you've seen in the data that takes us across all of K-12? We spent great time today in middle school. Let's broaden it out a little bit.
Yeah, so we see very similar results from the students in elementary grades and also elementary teachers as well and similar from the high school standpoint. I was looking at, in preparing this presentation, I was looking at some of the differences amongst teachers, because I think that that's where you see differences in how technology is being used. I would say, and I don't want to overly generalize here, but people quite often will ask me, I sometimes find that elementary teachers are the most responsive to using technology in creative ways and being more willing to re-engineer their lessons, their units of study to incorporate technology than their peers in high school.
Interesting.
So from an efficacy standpoint, we've done a lot of efficacy research in elementary grades, even kindergarten, first and second grade. It's really interesting to look at the mindset of the teachers around that. And correspondingly, we know that the little kiddos are coming to school with having a lot more access to technology at home than they ever did before. So I'll give you one example. We ask students every year, what's your preferred way of reading? Is it on a screen or is it in a printed book or a printed article? We still see about a third of high school and middle school students say their preference is the their preference is the screen. 2/3 say they're printed materials are their preference. But the younger kiddos, the elementary students that are coming into school with mom and dad that have read to them on devices, they like the interactivity, they like the touch tactile component of it. Almost 2/3 of them say that it is reading or having a book read to them on a device that is their preference. That's a major shift in the way that we're thinking about the learning process happening in elementary grades. And I think it's really interesting to keep track of all of that. So there's a lot of really fascinating things that are happening from a technology standpoint in elementary grades, fabulous products, but the teachers are now catching up to the perceptions and the changes in the students' behaviors.
That's just an absolutely fascinating set of insights, Julie, and it makes me think a lot about how to interact with the younger, shorter people in my own life. A little bit less paper, a little bit more screen. I think that's absolutely brilliant, and I appreciate that insight. I appreciate all of the insights, Julie, that you've shared with us today. The fact that you've dedicated your career to helping us understand what's going on in the hearts and minds of the educators, of the students, of the parents, and figuring out how we can do a better job of communicating with the whole group. I think that's completely brilliant. I thank you for that. I look forward to seeing everybody again next month when we talk about education conferences. Live events are coming back in our future. And so in December, we're going to kick that topic off. We're a little rusty when it comes to live events. And so I think that's going to be a very, very exciting discussion topic for us in December. Julie, I thank you one more time. I wish everybody who's joined us today the happiest of Thanksgiving and an extra piece of pumpkin pie for joining us today. We'll see you all real soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. Bye-bye, folks.